Good afternoon, and thank you so much for this opportunity to present our research on the communication of anti-cancer drug benefits. I hope this research will contribute to the ongoing discussions over the last couple of days about some of the specific ways in which written medicines information needs to be improved. Next slide, please. So I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators, Health Action International, who supported the original research, and also the UK's Economic and Social Research Council, who supported some engagement work that we undertook based on this research. Next slide, please. So, as everyone in this virtual room probably already knows, there's extensive evidence that patients value and need high-quality written information from trustworthy and reliable sources, and they appreciate this information to supplement verbal information from conversations with clinicians. And specifically, we know that patients want written information about drug benefits as well as harms, and that many patients also want to be told about important clinical uncertainties and knowledge gaps. And indeed, numerous regulatory consultations in 2004, 5, 9, and 14 with EMA's network of patients and consumer representatives confirmed that benefits and risks should always be communicated together. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there are, next slide, please. So there are particular challenges in the context of cancer care, and the provision of high quality information is therefore correspondingly particularly important for people with cancer. So first, many new drugs are approved on relatively weak evidence, with limited or no information about the outcomes that are most important to patients. Yet in the absence of explicit information, we know that people tend to assume that the quality of evidence is high. So second, patients with cancer must often balance toxicity of treatment against sometimes marginal or unclear benefits. And again, since we know that individual patients' tolerance for risk of harm or their tolerance for uncertainty of benefit varies, it's essential that patients are given full and clear information. And finally, there's extensive evidence that patients with cancer can overestimate drug benefits and misunderstand the intent of treatment. For example, in a study of around 1,000 patients with metastatic lung or colorectal cancer, around 70 and 80% respectively mistakenly believed that chemotherapy might cure the cancer. Next slide, please. So medicines regulators are in a unique position to provide clear, accurate, and independent information to challenge these commonly held misperceptions, and to support patient decision-making and genuine consent to treatment. And as we discussed yesterday, current EU legislation does not require inclusion of drug benefit information in patient leaflets, but this is permitted so long as it's consistent with the SMPC, is useful for patients, and is non-promotional. And in addition, since 2004, EMA has been required to produce an electronic EPAR summary for the public, which they also call the Medicines Overview. And in contrast to the package leaflets for patients, which are drafted by the manufacturer and approved by EMA, these summaries are actually written by EMA medical writers and also, always include a section on the drug benefits that were shown in clinical studies. Next slide, please. So we wanted to explore whether regulated medicines information about new anti-cancer drugs is actually meeting patients' information needs with respect to drug benefits and related uncertainties. So our study included 29 anti-cancer drugs for 32 indications, first approved by EMA between 2017 and 19. And we compared the information about drug benefits that was contained in SMPCs, package leaflets, and the medicines overviews with EMA's detailed scientific assessment in the corresponding EPARs for each drug. And we reviewed a total of 116 documents. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that, consistent with previous research, many of the drugs in our cohort were approved based on weak study designs. For example, 40% of the main studies supporting approval lacked a comparator arm, with all the implications of that for interpretability of results. And EMA assessors frequently raise concern with respect to deficiencies in the design, conduct, analysis, or findings of studies. It's also important to note that the vast majority of drugs, 72%, were approved without evidence that they extend survival or improve patients' quality of lives. Instead, most drugs were approved based on surrogate endpoints that haven't been shown to predict improved survival or improved quality of life. Next slide, please. So that was the evidence base. And we evaluated these public and patient information sources to determine the frequency with which this information or key categories of information were communicated. And you can see these categories across the top of this figure. So they included general information about the drug, the indication and how the drug works, information about the study supporting approval, and the nature and magnitude of the benefits shown. And you can see just by eyeballing the bottom row, which relates to the patient information leaflets, that patient information leaflets, the written patient information leaflets that are produced by manufacturers, contain the least information, and no information at all. None of the patient information leaflets contain information about how the drug had been studied or what benefits had been shown. So if you look at the blue columns to the right, relating to communication of drug benefits, you can see that the public summaries, or the EMA's medicines overviews, did a much better job at reporting drug benefits according to the primary study endpoints. However, information on the outcomes that are most important to patients, so information on survival and quality of life, were rarely communicated. Only 13% of the public summaries contained information about whether or not the drug extended life, and none included information about whether or not the drug had been shown to improve quality of life. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. If you go back, in contrast and on the left, you can see that information about a drug's mechanism of action, how the drug works in the body, was nearly always communicated in patient and public sources. So included in 75% of the public summaries and 94% of the patient information leaflets. Sorry, next slide, please. So the first problem is that regulated information about anti-cancer drugs appears to prioritize the information that's least important for patients. So in a poll we conducted involving 30 patients, consumers, clinicians, and topic experts on their priorities for communicating drug benefit information, participants voted that the most important categories of information to communicate related to what difference the drug had made for patients in clinical trials and what is not known about drug benefits. And participants judged information on the drug's mechanism of action as the least important category of information. Next slide, please. So we also evaluated the extent to which evidence uncertainties were communicated. So in the EPARS, we found that EMA assessors reported high levels of uncertainty with respect to the evidence base for the drugs in our sample. So for example, you can see in the ringed area of this figure that nearly half of all EPARS, for nearly half of all EPARS, EMA assessors had expressed concerns about the therapeutic value of the drug. What this meant was that they expressed concerns in terms of the uncertainty around the magnitude of the benefit that had been shown, or in terms of whether demonstrated benefits were actually clinically meaningful for patients. However, these concerns were rarely communicated to healthcare professionals, patients, or the public. So they were rarely communicated to healthcare professionals in the SMPCs as well, because we looked at those leaflets. Could you click on, please? So an example is the case of atezolizumab for metastatic urothelial cancer, with EMA scientists observing that there are substantial uncertainties regarding the efficacy of the drug. Next slide, please. However, these uncertainties and the evidence gaps with respect to patient important outcomes for this drug were not communicated in the public summary. The public summary failed to communicate that the drug had failed to demonstrate a gain in overall survival, despite the fact that the study was actually powered to detect such a gain. So this was one of the few studies that actually was measuring overall survival as a primary study endpoint. But this was not communicated. Instead, there was a much more ambiguous statement that patients given the drug lived slightly longer, although there was an acknowledgement that the difference could be due to chance. But it's difficult to know how patients or the public generally are going to interpret that statement. Next slide, please. So in the absence of clear communication about these important categories of information, descriptions in patient leaflets and medicines overviews may be confusing or even misleading for a lay public. For example, descriptions of drug mechanisms of action in patient leaflets included statements about drugs attacking tumor cells, triggering the death and destroying cancer cells. and descriptions in public summaries, the EMA's public summaries, of commonly used surrogate endpoints, for example, statements that patients responded to treatment or lived for longer without their disease worsening, are likely to be misunderstood by patients without explicit information about what this means or does not mean for patient survival and quality of life. Next slide, please. So we know these descriptions of surrogate endpoints are going to be confusing because two very recent studies, in fact, by FDA show that without an explicit disclosure, such as we do not know whether drug X helps patients live longer, these common descriptions of overall response and progression-free survival are likely to be misinterpreted as statements that patients live longer. Next slide, please. So what are the implications in summary? So information produced or disseminated by drug regulators has the potential to address common misperceptions about anti-cancer medicines. But currently, critical information that's needed for informed decision-making and consent to treatment is frequently missing from regulated information sources for new cancer drugs. We know that there are high levels of misunderstanding about new anti-cancer medicines and about medicines in general. So this is really addressing points that have been raised throughout the discussion today, actually. It's important not just to address and to monitor current misinformation, but also to know how and to do testing around how people interpret the kinds of statements that are included in the written medicines information. And unfortunately, we do know from this testing that the content of some regulated medicines information leaflets may actually be compounding patient misunderstanding. New slide, please. So what are some of the ways forward? I was really happy to hear about proposals to revise the current QRD template to encourage more focus on patient-relevant content. In addition, if it's not too late, is it possible to press for changes to the information that needs to be contained within the package leaflet on a statutory, to put that on a statutory footing in the context of the new EU legislative review? But in the absence of legislative change, it should still be possible to improve the information contained in the EMA's medicines overviews, but also to improve the accessibility of these overviews, which are currently actually quite difficult to find, even for researchers on the EMA's website. So we acknowledge that there are real challenges to this. More work needs to be done to better understand how to communicate evidence uncertainties in particular in a sensitive way to patients, and also to better explain surrogate endpoints to patients in a sensitive way. We need to understand actually that in some contents, inclusion of benefit information is not a straightforwardly positive thing for patients. And we need to better understand how to present sometimes complex benefit risk information together. However, there's quite a bit of research and there's a good evidence base which suggests how we can begin to make these changes and make important improvements now. So the EMA could look at adopting something like the drugs facts box that are being developed in the US. These adopt evidence-based principles of effective communication about drug benefit harms and uncertainties, and they were actually shown in large randomized trials to improve patient knowledge, comprehension, and decision-making processes. And I have an example of one of these on the next slide. This is for Lunesta, an insomnia drug. And on the slide following this, if you could click on, please. There's an example showing a kind of visual representation, just of benefits here actually, of the kind that Françoise was referencing yesterday. This is showing the benefits of statin in coronary heart disease. I mean, probably many people are familiar with this, and this is actually a visual that's produced for clinicians to help them to communicate this information to patients. So it's also important to keep in mind that actually one of the key ways that we can help patients understand this information is to help clinicians to communicate it. Okay, many thanks, and I will end there.